How did ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs work? And how could you tell words apart when the ancient Egyptians didn't write the vowel sounds? In this video, I'll walk you through how the ancient Egyptians used particular hieroglyphs to help you read their complex writing system and tell certain words apart. Welcome to Voices of Ancient Egypt, where we demystify the words and lives of the ancient Egyptians through animated videos like this one. If you're new here, I'd love to have you subscribe and hit that bell icon so you don't miss future videos like this one. Hi everyone! Let's jump right into the 3 things that you need to know about this special type of categorizing hieroglyph. But first, if you haven't seen the first video in this series, which is about how hieroglyphs were mostly not like emojis but a little bit like them, you'll want to check that out first. I'll link it in the cards up in the corner and also in the description below. Number 1. Some hieroglyphs represent categories rather than sounds. So in my previous video, did you notice that I didn't mention these signs at the end of these words? That's because these are another type of hieroglyph that I wasn't talking about there. These, when they're used at the end of a word like this, they don't represent a sound, but rather they give you an idea of the category of the thing or action that the word is describing. Egyptologists usually call these determinatives, but linguists call these semantic signs, and you might even call them meaning signs. And these words are probably more accurate. However, since you will see the word determinatives in almost any textbook that you get and any Egyptology book you get, I'm going to stick with that term here. So let's look at an example. Here's the example of the verb to go out. Now you'll notice it ends in a pair of walking legs. These walking legs usually show up at the ends of words that describe motion, such as this one. So to go out, to come, to go, words like that, right? Now the other signs in these words, in this case with to go out, the house sign, actually represent sounds, not a concept like the walking legs do. And if you're not familiar with this part, you should go back and watch my first video in this series, which I'll link in the description below. All right, another example. Here is the verb to throw. And at the end of this word is something that's probably a little harder to figure out if you're not an ancient Egyptian, but this is what we call a throw stick. It was a stick that was used while hunting birds, and you threw it actually at the birds. So this is why this particular determinative is associated with the idea of throwing. Before moving on to number 2, I wanted to let you guys know real quick that I have a free guide on how hieroglyphs work, which has these examples and others in it, and you can get it for free by heading over to my website at voicesofancientegypt.com/guide, and you can find the link in the description below too. So go grab it and then come right back and finish this video. Number 2, hieroglyphs that represented whole words usually had a dash for their determinative. So in the case of words like pair for house and for arm, these are being used as what are called logograms. That is, the single sign by itself spells out the whole word. So in these cases, they still usually have a determinative of a type, but it's different from the other determinatives. So normally you would expect, a determinative that had something to do with the idea of a house or the idea of an arm. But in these cases, because you already have a house and an arm hieroglyph, instead, the ancient Egyptians used a simple dash. This was to let the reader know that he or she should read that hieroglyph as an entire word, not as part of another word. So, for example, when we use the house hieroglyph to actually mean the word for house, a dash is either to the side or just below it. And likewise, you see the same thing with the arm hieroglyph. It'll be to the side or below it, and this is to let you know that it's spelling the word for arm, rather than being part of another word. All right, so let's look at an example. Let's put a sentence together. So how would we order somebody, go out from the house? Here's how we would do it in Egyptian. First, the house hieroglyph. Pair is how we pronounce it in modern times, with the walking legs, meaning go out. Then we would use an M, which is what's called a preposition, meaning from in this case. Then we would use another pair or house sign with a dash, because in this case it means house rather than go out. So if you put this together, in English, this becomes go out from the house, as if you're ordering somebody to go out from the house. Now you'll notice, a little side note here, that in English we use the word the there, but there's no equivalent in the Egyptian. And that's because in Middle Egyptian, the classic stage of the language, they did not have what we call a definite article. That is in English, the. But to make English make sense, we have to supply the. So this is why I have it there and there's no equivalent in the Egyptian. So you can see from this example how pair, this house sign, each time with a different determinative, can spell these different words, and it's actually not that hard to tell them apart. Number 3. Names needed determinatives too. Even names needed so-called determinatives. For example, when I write my name in hieroglyphs, I do it like this. M, R, N, D, Aleph, seated woman. Now my name is Melinda, but you'll notice that I don't actually try to do a one-to-one equivalent between the hieroglyphs and the letters in my name. And that's because you can't really do that accurately, because my name is made up of elements from European languages, and I pronounce it like an English speaker. Well, Egyptian, on the other hand, has a different set of sounds, and there aren't always equivalents for my name. This is why it's really kind of tricky and impossible to render your name correctly when you use these so-called hieroglyphic alphabet charts that you see online all over or in museums and so forth as a simplification. Instead, when you know a little bit more about hieroglyphs, it gives you the knowledge to be able to tinker with it a little bit and try to get a little closer equivalent, even if you can't get it absolutely precise because your name has different sounds. So here's an example of one of these judgment calls. You'll notice I didn't use a hieroglyph for the letter L. There's no L in here, right? And that's because for most of ancient Egyptian history, there was no hieroglyph to write the sound for the letter L, because Egyptian didn't have this sound. The only time they needed to write an L sound is usually if they were trying to transcribe a foreign name into Egyptian. And when they did do this, when they were taking a foreign name and putting it in Egyptian, what they usually did is they substituted an R. So this is why I use an R rather than an L when I'm writing my name in hieroglyphs. And these sounds to an English speaker sound pretty different, but linguistically they're actually closely related, and in some other languages they sound much more alike. So for example, even in modern Egypt, where people speak Egyptian Arabic today, my name, when I introduce myself, people very often mistake it for Marinda rather than Melinda. And I'll often have to really emphasize the L sound to get people to hear the difference. Now, I'll explain some of the other choices that I made for the signs in my name in my next video, but for now, let's focus on the final sign, the seated woman. So you'll notice that I haven't given a letter equivalent for this sign, and that's because this is one of those so-called determinatives. The seated woman lets you know that this is a name or potentially another word that describes a woman. If I were a man, we would have a seated man determinative at the end of my name instead of the seated woman. One fun thing to know about these determinatives in names is that they're often left out on monuments. And the reason for this is that usually there's a picture of the person on the monument. So like, especially if you're looking at a statue or a stela, for example, there's often a picture of that person there. And since there's a picture of the person right next to the name, the ancient Egyptians didn't feel a need to repeat by having another picture of a person that is a determinative at the end of a name. So next time you're at a museum, or you're just scrolling through some Egyptology accounts on Instagram, take a look and see if you can spot some names. See if you can find some names that have determinatives in some cases, and then also see if you can find some names where there aren't any determinatives because they're right next to a picture of that person. It's pretty fun when you start being able to pick out this kind of thing. Now that you know the basics of how hieroglyphs work, join me in the next video to learn how to use them to read and write names, including your own, which we'll do in the next video, which you can find right down here in the corner. And if it's not out yet, click subscribe so you won't miss it. See you in the next video.